Alright, let's go back to the very beginning. When I started streaming on Twitch, I began with Overwatch. Overwatch somehow became the catalyst for a bunch of my friendships and romantic relationships that have lasted to this day. I met my boyfriend of almost 5 years in an Overwatch game. We went through fucking COVID together. Holy shit. The point is, I've been around the block. Overwatch was the first game that I played competitively at all. I went from a hard-stuck silver Mercy main to a hard-stuck Masters Mercy main. My biggest claim to fame was queuing with Faria once. I'm better than a good portion of the player base of the game and a whole lot worse than the rest of you. A big joke in my friend groups is that I'm the most suspicious Mercy main they've ever met because I played literally every character pre-Overwatch 2. And for the record, when you're gay and you play with other gays, you can't all play Mercy. So a bitch had to learn how to do other things too. Overwatch used to be my bread and butter. I was there when GOATS was a thing. I was there when the only reason we were okay with no more updates was because of the promise of PvE in Overwatch 2, and even then, just barely. Double shield meta was rough. I was there when we loved Jeff from the Overwatch team, when we hated Jeff from the Overwatch team, and loved Jeff from the Overwatch team again. I bought the first fucking battle pass because I was hyped as shit, and then Jeff from the Overwatch team stopped being from the Overwatch team. He became just Jeff. PvE was dead in the water. The battle pass was certainly a battle pass. Not at all greedy. So fucking greedy. And then let's pile on all of the other shit that made the community pissed. We could go on for hours about it, to be honest. Yeah, there was a bunch of dumb shit that happened that made me finally quit. But I'm back again. Fuck. It's like an abusive relationship, so let's talk about it. Welcome to It's Giving Tree, the podcast that nobody asked for, but I insisted on giving anyway. It's giving everything I've ever wanted to talk about. I'm your host, Tree, and you can find me live on Twitch at twitch.tv/treejpg and catch up on all the fun on YouTube. Take a seat, settle down, and let's get into the dirty details. It's giving... I started playing Overwatch again. Fuck. Overwatch's original design landed it somewhere in between being a MOBA and being a competitive shooter. The character schemata followed Holy Trinity MMORPG rules, a collection of 3 character classes that built up the foundation of a balanced party. The MMO Holy Trinity is a gaming trope where combat revolves around 3 different roles: the tank, who intercepts the enemy's attacks and survives the ensuing damage, the healer, who keeps their allies alive by healing damage, and the DPS, short for damage per second, whose job is dealing damage to defeat enemies. This division of labor allowed for characters to specialize in a specific role, making each character more unique and interesting. The game also had another side to it: Call of Duty gameplay that prioritized the amount of kills that a player could rack up in a match. Don't believe me? There was a medal system that was criticized as not giving the bigger picture in the game. Gold meant you had the most of a statistic in the match. Gold medal eliminations, you've racked up the highest count of player kills. Gold medal damage, you've done the most damage in the match. And so on, ad infinitum. So this was a no man's land without role select, a hero shooter where players were encouraged to just play who they wanted to, what they resonated with. The game did give a few helpful reminders here and there, like there wasn't enough supports, or it would be super helpful if there was a tank, but at the end of the day, it was up to player discretion. Games could be super lopsided, with not a single person on a team wanting to play either tank or support, and sometimes they could win against 2-2-2. Not often, mind you, but it happened enough for people to justify doing it. And by the way, 2-2-2 referred to a standard team composition that was made up of 2 tanks, 2 supports, and 2 DPS. So say what you want about Overwatch in its early days, but people loved the gameplay. Maybe it's just nostalgia, but a lot of people saw the first few years as the game's glory days. But then Brigitte happened, and that's when I started playing. So let's explore the various eras of Overwatch, as determined by the pro scene. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to get into is the dive meta. I did not get to experience this one personally, but every time I have heard about it, players seem to have these like rose colored lenses and are just like, this was the best thing. This was peak Overwatch. There was nothing better. So the dive meta emerged in 2016 and lasted till 2017 during the game's early seasons, and was characterized by high mobility, high damage heroes. Think tanks like Winston and Diva, DPS like Genji and Tracer. There was an aggressive, dive-oriented playstyle where players would focus on quick eliminations and rapid rotations between their abilities. So, since Overwatch is a hero shooter, characters will have a set amount of abilities that they can use. So, for example, Winston is a giant scientific ape, and he has the ability to leap around like 30 meters. He has a giant dome shield, and he's holding a Tesla cannon that just shocks people for like 30 damage per second. I don't know if that's the exact numbers, but bear with me. So essentially what these characters would do was they would all use their initial cooldown to jump in to vulnerable members of a fight, such as supports, and try to eliminate them as fast as possible and then dive back out. So this composition typically featured Winston, Diva, Genji, Tracer, and as we got more supports, the supports ended up being Ana, Zenyatta typically, but you would see variations with like Mercy, Lucio, etc. So the dive meta was all about speed, agility, and relentless pressure. Teams would dive onto objectives using their mobility and burst damage to quickly take out enemies and capture points. The dive meta was considered to be a high skill composition, requiring precise timing, coordination, and mechanical skill to execute effortlessly. And to a lot of people, this was when Overwatch made the most amount of sense in 6v6, because there was a clear plot line to follow when you were watching the game. There was a clear back and forth. Characters would go in, they would try to get the kills that they needed, and then they would get out. And it was more seeing how players were able to execute that play style. There was a lot of communication between calling out where we were going, what we were going to do, and then adapting to what the enemy team would respond with. There was a lot of layers to it. A lot of knowledge with the game was necessary in order to like have a deeper understanding of what was going on. But at the same time, it was exciting because, you know, you could see players trying to make things happen. Now, unfortunately, the dive meta eventually gave way to the GOAT's composition, which countered the dive playstyle with its emphasis on survivability and sustain. The balance changes and new hero releases continued to shift the meta, eventually leading to the double shield meta. The dive meta remains a nostalgic favorite among many Overwatch players and fans, remembered for its fast-paced action and high-flying plays. I just wish I got to experience it. I was very much a late adopter to this game, at least when Overwatch 1 existed before Overwatch 2 existed. It took me a solid 2 years to like actually start playing, and by that time, dive meta was gone, Mercy Mass Res was gone. I never got to experience any of that. So part of that really sucks, but it's interesting being part of a player base that can observe what happened and have like opinions about dive without actually experiencing it. Now, the next era, the next meta within Overwatch, you would think I'd be extremely excited to talk about it because this is when I started to play the game. This is when I got invested, when I started to learn what it meant to be a support in this game, how I could help out a team. But it was really weird being introduced to Overwatch during this time, because this was when players started to assert that the dev team didn't have an idea of how to balance their game. And you could see like the consequences of this meta even to this day. of like how the dev team wants to push forward and like create new metas, new team compositions, new characters. And the meta that I'm talking about is GOATs. The GOATs composition highlighted the issues with the game's flexibility and balance, as teams were able to field multiple tanks and supports, making it difficult for opposing teams to counter. This led to a stale meta, where teams were forced to adapt to the GOATs composition or risk losing. And this is really where I feel like the game's competitive aspirations and Blizzard's desire for having a professional esports league, the OWL, clashed with the needs and preferences of the general player base. Blizzard essentially had to make a choice between catering to the pros or the larger player base, and ultimately they kind of decided on neither of them. Yay! So, let's enter GOATs. I don't know the exact lore behind this team anymore, but essentially they created a team composition that was ridiculously effective to the point it dominated the professional league's meta. It kicked out something that both pro players and general audiences love to watch, which was the dive meta. And the epicenter of this team composition was Reinhardt Squire, Brigitte, who has her own history in this game of just being hated and essentially being like the doomsday character, the person who ended everything by her existence. So, remember earlier how I said most people wanted to play the DPS role? Well, this team comp left no room for them. 3-3. 3 tanks, 3 supports. The tanks did competitive damage, they were bulky as hell, there was no reason to use a DPS. It was just like, okay, so for doing relatively the same amount of damage, I get to have 3 monsters essentially being supported by 3 healers. So like you throw in these 3 supports that enhance these tanks, and they covered each other's weaknesses in a way that was both beautiful and disgusting. You basically got a match made in hell. The community was in fucking shambles. Average players wanted to replicate what the pros are doing, which led to half-assed gameplay where no one knew what they were doing. I remember being silver and being like, oh guys, what if we tried out GOATs? And other people in the lobby would be like, yeah, sure, let's do it. So we would lock in the 3 tanks, we would lock in the 3 supports, which is like Reinhardt, Zarya, Diva, and then Moira, Brigitte, Lucio. And we didn't know what we were doing. This team composition required an amount of teamwork and amount of like communication that wasn't initially obvious to the general audiences. So it was just like us imitating something that we knew was really good and getting results out of it. But most of the time, it just kind of resulted in a loss and people just not having fun. Pro players were stuck playing this comp and only this comp. It became too dominant and there was no way to change the characters that were core to this composition without damaging the Holy Trinity schemata. So if we nerfed all the tanks and supports, we'd be stuck in Call of Duty lobbies where instead of 2-2-2, which is in a lot of people's minds the ideal state of the game, we would just have 6 DPS on both sides, because why play the other classes if they're just dead weight? So for the sins of GOATs in the competitive scene, open queue couldn't stick around. We were heading into role queue land where players selected roles that they would be playing before the match even started. This killed GOATs, but it eventually created new problems. So role queue was essentially introduced as a solution to the problem of like, okay, so we're locking in 3 tanks, we're locking in 3 supports. How do we stop that from happening? So essentially, players had to make a choice between being one of either 2 tanks, 2 DPS, or 2 supports. And there are no more variations to team compositions, at least in that way. And this was to encourage more balanced team compositions, reduce the dominance of single compositions like GOATs, increase the importance of teamwork and strategy, and overall improve the competitive experience for everyone. When role queue happened, I liked it, and I'm still part of the people that prefer role queue over open queue. There were too many times when I would play open queue on ladder where we would just all decide, okay, so we're all going to play DPS. And as someone who didn't want to play that role, someone who wanted to either play tank or support, it fucking sucked. As a tank, if you don't have anyone to heal you or support you, your job is to take damage, to get attention. So you're getting all this attention and then you're not being helped by your teammates. So you just die on repeat. But then if you're like the lone support in the team, it becomes your job to like keep everyone alive. And that also fucking sucks. What I like about role queue is it was the perfect division of labor. And there was enough ways for both players within each role to play off of each other and cover each other's weaknesses based on their play styles. So we got to experience tank synergies, Reinhardt Zarya, Orisa Roadhog, Winston Diva from Dive meta. The way that these characters and their kits would communicate with each other and help each other out, it was unique to Overwatch, to hero shooters in general. It's why it became as big as it did. The way that teamwork was enhanced in this game wasn't seen in other games like it. And that's because most FPS did follow like either CSGO rules or Call of Duty, where it was just like, yeah, there is a form of strategy, but a lot of it was based on individual play. But yeah, so by restricting teams to a specific number of tanks, damage, and support heroes, role queue aimed to create a more balanced and dynamic meta where teams would need to adapt and strategize to succeed. So in a way, the GOAT's composition was the catalyst for the introduction of role queue, which has since become a core part of Overwatch's competitive gameplay. Now we're gonna go down the shitter again. So, because Overwatch is a hero shooter, when new heroes are introduced, and if the player base does want new heroes, it keeps the game fresh. It makes people have to learn more things and see how the game will interact with these new characters and their new abilities. It's fun. But on the other side of the coin, sometimes a new character is so fundamentally strong and different from the rest of the cast that it creates a meta that is toxic and then becomes stale. So with the introduction of Sigma in July 2019, the Overwatch meta shifted once again, leading to a new era of dominance by tank-heavy compositions. Sigma's unique abilities, particularly his experimental barrier and kinetic grasp, allowed him to provide an unprecedented level of protection and sustain for his team. When paired with another tank hero like Reinhardt or Orisa, the double shield meta was born. So double shield. Tanks, some of them were characterized by their ability to create shields, barriers for their team to play around, so that way they can capture space and protect their allies. And this was fine because Reinhardt and Orisa, who were the original two characters that had shields, and even then, Reinhardt was the main one. Reinhardt came out first. Their kits didn't have innate synergy with each other to the point where you would see Reinhardt Orisa compositions. It just didn't work. They both wanted to do different things. Orisa had a very slow play style. Reinhardt playstyles tended to be more aggressive, where they wanted to brawl with the other team and be heavily supported by their off tank and their supports and their DPS. Sigma could do that and heavily enhance it. It was the first time really that we got like a flex main tank, where Sigma could fulfill the role of a main tank because of the way that his shields and his kinetic grasp worked, but it worked significantly more with another character that had shields in a way that it was able to eliminate the one weakness of shield uptime, which is when the tank's shield goes down, it has to recharge, or they have to wait for a cooldown. When both characters have a shield, when one shield breaks, the other shield goes up. So games would devolve into staring matches between two teams of 6 players while they just shot at each other's shields until one of them broke, and then maybe they got a pick in between the next shield being shifted up. And to be honest, it was made even worse because eventually we got another support as well that fit into that comp like a glove. And that was Baptiste. Baptiste had Immortality Field. And Immortality Field, what it does is he deploys a drone, and within that area that the drone is in, all characters cannot die. So what would essentially happen is we would get these bunker comps where Sigma and Orisa traded off using their shields, using their cooldowns to make sure that their team was always covered. For any times when they were not able to get those shields off, say the DPS were really, really on it with knocking those things down, using their damage per second to peel through the layers. There was now a 3rd level of defense by the supports, and it was Immortality Field, which prevented characters from dying. So you would be stuck in a loop as a DPS player, as honestly, as anyone within the enemy team, where there was no way to feasibly kill them. And even if you did, there were layers of protection like Baptiste with his Immortality Field, Ana with Nade, Mercy with Resurrection. It was almost impossible for progress to be made. So this meta became dominant in professional play, with teams struggling to find ways to counter the sheer durability and protection offered by the double shield composition. The double shield meta led to a period of stagnation in the meta, which teams focusing on countering the composition rather than exploring new strategies. This ultimately led to balance changes and the introduction of new heroes and strategies to counter the double shield comp, but it wasn't very effective at the end of the day. And watching esports, watching the Overwatch League, it showcased the game's ongoing balance struggles and the adaptability of professional teams. They had basically found the peak way to be aggressive and defensive at the same time. There was no other way to play the game, and professional players wouldn't want to do things that wasn't conducive to getting a win, because at the end of the day, they need to win. They need to get the tournament money in order to sustain their team. So we were kind of just fucked. This is really where the biggest transition occurred in Overwatch. So eventually, the Overwatch team decided to move to 5v5 in Overwatch 2. For several reasons, largely driven by the lessons we learned from the 3 metas we discussed. Dive meta. The team saw how the dive meta's focus on mobility and burst damage led to high skill, high stakes playstyles. However, this also resulted in a meta that was difficult for new players to join and struggled with sustainability. Then we had the GOATS meta. The GOATS composition highlighted the issues with flexibility and balance in the game. The team realized that the 6v6 format allowed for too much specialization, leading to an arms race of counterpicking and a stale meta. So that's when we got role queue. Double shield meta then existed. The double shield meta showed how the game's balance could be dominated by a single composition, leading to a lack of diversity in strategies and playstyles. So by moving to 5v5, the Overwatch dev team aimed to increase strategic depth. With fewer players, each hero's impact is amplified and teams must be more thoughtful about their compositions and strategies. Improve game pacing. 5v5 games tend to be faster paced and more action packed, reducing the likelihood of stalemates and encouraging more aggressive play. Enhance diversity and creativity. With fewer slots to fill, teams are incentivized to explore different heroes and playstyles, leading to a more diverse and dynamic meta. And streamline gameplay. 5v5 reduces the complexity of teamfights, making it easier for players to understand and engage with the game. So, yeah, there would be times when I, as someone who knew what every character in the game did, there were times when I would watch the Overwatch League and just go, there are a bunch of colors on the screen, and I am so glad I don't suffer from epilepsy, because I would be knocked the fuck out. It was so hard to follow what was happening. By transitioning to 5v5, the Overwatch dev team aimed to create a more engaging, dynamic, and accessible game that encouraged strategic play, creativity, skillful gameplay. But the thing is, the transition to 5v5 had significant consequences for the tank role, which in turn affected team compositions and gameplay. So let's go down a list of some key points here. So here's what happened with the tank role changes. We shifted from main tank to flex tank. The focus shifted from dedicated main tanks like Reinhardt to more flexible damage dealing tanks like the reworked Orisa, because Orisa couldn't function in 5v5. They had to change her kit. There was an increased emphasis on damage. Tanks were now expected to contribute more to damage output, making them more hybrid roles. And furthermore, counter-swapping became far more prevalent because there was only one tank. What happens is tank players have to constantly switch to the counter of the current tank that they are playing. And a lot of the times this feels cheap and makes the game less enjoyable for everyone, because it becomes an arms race of, all right, so they're playing Winston. I'm going to play Orisa, so that way I can counter Winston's kit and make him useless. Okay, so Winston is going to switch. He's going to pick something like Maga or Ramatra. This will in turn make Orisa have to switch, and so on and so forth. And it's not fun. It really isn't fun to be thinking to yourself, wow, even as someone who isn't playing tank at the moment, is just like, we could be winning right now if our tank switched. That's not fun. It's not a fun thing to even like project onto someone, like, you need to switch right now. You need to stop enjoying what you're enjoying so that way we can win. And then there are further consequences for team compositions. There are fewer dedicated supports. With only one tank, teams often opt for more flexible supports that can also deal damage. This is the rise of Kiriko. This is the continued dominance of Ana, because they can do both. There's further emphasis on damage-focused compositions. Since teams prioritize damage output so much, it leads to more aggressive dive-oriented playstyles, which, to the dev team's credit, when we think of the dive meta in Overwatch 1, those were the glory days. But on the other hand, because there's only one tank now, we lost a great deal of complexity that made watching dive meta and playing dive meta more palatable for greater audiences, at least in my opinion. There's also just less emphasis on team-wide survivability. With fewer tanks, teams focused less on collective survivability and more on individual skill and aggression. And I suppose some people can find that to be more fun. I know that there are definitely a bunch more people playing Overwatch 2 now than they played Overwatch 1, because the first iteration of Overwatch required such a deep understanding of the way that the characters played off of each other in order to be an effective player overall in the game. Basically, if you played Overwatch, you were stuck within the vacuum, within the space that it occupied, because it was so unique within its niche. Becoming 5v5, creating less emphasis on the roles, the holy trinity that the game was initially based on, it broadened the horizons, broadened the amount of people that could play the game. But at the same time, a lot of characters lost their identities. And for the player base that was not excited to adapt, like me, it just didn't feel good going from 6v6 to 5v5. Now, that isn't to say that I don't prefer 5v5. I do. I'm one of those people that do actually prefer it. I can't help but mourn the places where mourn the things that we've lost during this transition. This was a far more significant blow to like team composition and creativity than I'd argue open queue to roll queue was. And to be fair, the overall gameplay changes. Yes, faster gameplay. 5v5 games are generally more faster paced, with more emphasis on quick eliminations and rotations of abilities. Players have to rely on their own skill and game sense, which is a plus for a lot of people who want to feel like they are the hero of their team, the hero of their story. And there's an increased importance of ultimates. Ultimates become more decisive in 5v5, as teams rely on them to turn the tide of battle. Yeah, on one hand, a lot of people can resonate with the more aggressive, fast-paced gameplay style. But on the other, we can also miss the more strategic, team-focused gameplay of 6v6. Here is where we get to where I eventually quit the game. And it's because I'm a support player, but I wasn't just a support player, I was specifically a Mercy main. And there is a certain identity that Mercy mains have, a certain reputation that they garner, and to be fair, I do think it is warranted in some ways, in the way that we are very resistant to changes to our character. We are very passionate about how she plays and what we want out of Overwatch, because she provided something that we could not previously have in a first-person shooter. She provided the ability to create an impact, not by killing enemies, but by healing your allies, by enhancing the way that they play, enhancing their damage, getting a clutch resurrection off on someone who is carrying the team, someone who is able to like kill everyone because they are just that good at the game. Then in Overwatch 2, the schemata had to change. We stopped prioritizing reactive plays, defensive plays. So I get it. It's support, not healer. But fuck you. So the player base agrees that the game can't be played the way that I want to play. And I don't want to play the game that way. And so the question became, is this a game that I'm allowed to play? So there's this content creator out there who I heavily respect, because he honestly revolutionized the way that a lot of people played the support role. He's very good at the game. He goes by ML7, and he popularized a phrase and sentiment within the Overwatch community. It's support, not healer. And that's not to say that this was a revolutionary idea or anything. It's always been part of the game's identity. If you didn't do aggressive plays as a support ever, then you weren't trying to win. End of be all. However, this is the first time that I saw the phrase stick to the community's ethos of what game balance looks like. And I get it. I'm a Mercy main. Well, ex-Mercy main. I'm bad at the way the video game wants to be played. I'm not a hyper-aggressive support. Instead of joining the dark side of DPS Moiras, I chose to double down on healing with Lifeweaver in Overwatch 2. I only play that man now, and it's because I like slinging heals. I like pulling my allies, keeping them safe, and I don't necessarily get the same dopamine rush by eliminating enemies. I don't. It just doesn't satisfy my brain the same way. And so the 5v5 transition had a significant impact on the support role. leading to a shift away from these traditional healing focused supports. So let's go over like some key consequences. So for the support role changes, we went from healers to flex supports. Traditional healers like Mercy and even new releases like Lifeweaver became less prominent, while more flexible supports like Zenyatta, Lucio, Baptiste, and especially Kiriko, oh my god, Kiriko, gained more popularity. There was an increased emphasis on damage. Supports were now expected to contribute to damage output more than they ever had before, making them more hybrid roles. It was more important for your Kiriko, instead of healing the team, to try to go into the backline and get a quick pick on the enemy team. Maybe kill off the enemy healer and then teleport over back to your tank to like heal and, finish the rest of the fight. So yeah, there was like more solo responsibility for supports now. Team coordination in general just became less crucial when you took away that extra player. So there were consequences for support players. They needed to get a new skill set. Support players that primarily focused on healing had to focus more on their damage and utility. So the abilities that make them do things outside of just healing. So for example, Mercy Resurrection, Mercy Damage Boost. But even then, that was too passive. You didn't take the reins. You didn't cause a unique change within the game state. And changing the game state is typically using either your utility or your damage to kill a member of the enemy team so they stop their output. It's support not healer mentality. It was, again, a shift from healing to utility. The support role is no longer just about healing, but about providing utility, crowd control, and damage. And it's always been that way, but now it's even further shifted to that angle. And in a way, I suppose that is more skillful. It is good to see support players doing both. But at the same time, I miss being able to be primarily a healer. Like, I'll do it. I'll do the other stuff because it is necessary to win, and I know other people want to win, but it's just not how I had fun. The community at large, extremely negative towards healing focused playstyles, and I understand that. If you don't make aggressive plays and force significant cooldowns, you're not pushing towards a win condition. A lot of support players like to brag about low death counts, but if you don't take chances, you can't enable winning plays. I think it's very reasonable to believe that a proactive playstyle is better than a reactive one, but it just sucks to be pigeonholed. I want there to be more appreciation for good reactions to enemy cooldowns. And like, sure, in 5v5, there is one less player that the two supports have to sustain, yes. However, being down a player on either side is a much more significant change in game momentum. I'll admit that this shift in playstyle for supports is overall a good thing for game health. Supports in Overwatch in general have always been a powerful role. If they were not fulfilling their duty, as in helping their teammates, their DPS do more damage or keep their tanks up, it was very, very obvious who wasn't contributing. It was very clear. It should be fine that it is the way it is now. It really should be. But I don't like it. I just don't like it. But yeah, that's why I quit. Overwatch used to make me feel like I could be good at an FPS without actively hurting people. I didn't really know if Overwatch 2 was still a game that allowed me to play the game the way that I wanted, to create the impact the way that I wanted to. It was getting overtly clear. Overwatch began to outgrow me because I couldn't adapt. And yet I'm back again, because at the end of the day, Overwatch is fun. And I don't know what it means to be a competitive game. I don't know what it means to be really good at the game. I know statistically I am far better than a lot of people, but I also have to acknowledge that I'm far worse than the grandmasters to top 500 to the pro scene. So it's like I can have these opinions, but at the same time, it's like, is it valid for me to insert them? I used to love the challenge, that sense of accomplishment that I got playing the game. When I was first doing competitive, I was very, very dialed into being a solo queue Mercy main because I wanted to feel like I got a high rank based off of my skill and understanding of the game alone. And I made some really good friends along the way. I met my boyfriend in fucking Overwatch competitive. I love this game. I love the mechanics. I love the strategy. I love the team play, the coordination. I love fucking capturing objectives. I love pushing payloads. I've entered this state in Overwatch now where instead of trying to climb competitively, I only play quick play. I only play casually now. Because I understand that the way that I want to play the game is not how it should be played anymore. And there are some ways that that does close doors to me, because now that I am not grinding in competitive, now that I don't possess the rank that I did in Overwatch 1, because I do not participate in the grind, I'm not able to be part of certain spaces that I was starting to get to peek into once I reached Masters. I started seeing like content creators and other people and being like, wow, this is really cool. It was so fun socially to like be like, oh my god, I've watched this person's YouTube videos. Oh my god, I'm so nervous. What if they think I'm bad? But that was fun. And it was nice to be part of those spaces, but I don't think I have the capability to do so anymore. But I still love this game. Even now when I'm just playing quick play, I'm just like, wow, I fucking love Overwatch. I hate Overwatch. Oh well. I'm gonna keep playing it till it's gone, I guess. It's too important to me. Thanks for tuning into this episode of It's Giving Tree. If you want to connect with me beyond the podcast, you can find me on Twitch, TikTok, and YouTube at treejpg, and on Twitter at treepng. Stay tuned for future episodes of It's Giving Tree, where we'll dive into more topics, share more stories, and hopefully I continue to grow on you. Bye bye!